It started like any other summer morning in Marion, Indiana. A stretch of quiet roads, thick with humidity, the sound of sprinklers in the distance, lawnmowers buzzing faintly from blocks away. Daniel Wexler, 11 years old, had already been awake for an hour, rummaging through his small tackle box, making sure he had his favorite spinnerbait. It wasn't much, just a handful of lures and hooks collected from birthday gifts and hand-me-downs. But to him, it was everything. Fishing had become his ritual. Stillwater Pond, a tucked-away spot at the end of an overgrown trail, was where he went when the world felt too loud. It wasn't just a place, it was his place. Beth Wexler, his mother, remembered him saying he'd only be gone a few hours. She was in the kitchen folding laundry when he came downstairs, rod in hand, with that usual confident look he had when he felt grown. He told her he'd be back by dinner. She didn't think twice. He'd gone out alone before. It wasn't reckless. It was rural Indiana. Kids grew up knowing how to find their way home, especially Daniel. He was sharp, kind, and just cautious enough. Not the kind of boy who vanished. The ride to Stillwater Pond was no more than 10 minutes by bike, a straight shot down Jasper Trail Road, followed by a short dirt path that cut through the woods. The area was isolated, but not abandoned. Occasionally, other kids fished there. Sometimes an old man from town would sit by the edge of the water with a transistor radio and a cooler of beer. But most days, Daniel had the place to himself. He liked it that way. He was last seen around 7:40 a.m. by a neighbor walking their dog. Daniel waved, said he was heading to Stillwater. That was the last confirmed sighting of him alive. By early afternoon, Beth noticed the time. It wasn't like Daniel to miss lunch, even on a good fishing day. She called his cell. No answer. She waited another hour, called again, straight to voicemail. At 2:45 p.m., she drove to Stillwater herself. The trailhead was quiet. The bike wasn't there. She walked the path down to the pond. No one. Just stagnant water, a few scattered footprints in the dirt, and silence. She waited, then called his name. Over and over. Nothing. At 3:12 p.m., she dialed 911. The first officers arrived by 3:45. They scanned the pond's edge, asked routine questions, and wrote down basic descriptions. Daniel was 5'1", blonde hair, blue eyes. Last seen wearing a navy shirt and red Nike sneakers. Beth explained that he didn't have any friends nearby he'd go off with. He wasn't angry or depressed. He was excited that morning. He had plans. By dusk, the scene had changed. Police tape went up. More officers arrived. The volunteer fire department sent a boat. Divers were requested from the county. The pond was no more than 8 feet deep in the center, but murky, filled with silt and reeds. A dragging operation began. They found sticks, fishing lines, and garbage. But no sign of Daniel. No pole, no sandwich, no footprints leading back up the trail. A full search grid was organized by nightfall. Over 60 volunteers joined, neighbors, church friends, classmates' parents. They fanned out in concentric circles, covering the trail system, the brush, the roadside ditches. Flashlights cut through the dark. Some brought dogs. One man even brought a thermal scope used for coyote hunting. Still, nothing. Beth stayed near the trailhead the entire time. Her hands shook. Her voice cracked with every new answer she gave. Martin Wexler, Daniel's father, arrived at midnight after driving 4 hours from Chicago. He had moved there after the divorce. He hadn't spoken to Beth much in the past year, but now there was only one priority: finding their son. By morning, local news had picked up the story. Missing boy, age 11. Last seen walking to a pond. No evidence, no leads. K-9 units were brought in from Indianapolis. They picked up Daniel's scent near the southern bank of the pond, but it stopped cold near a patch of tall cattails. No disturbed ground, no signs of struggle, no drag marks. It was like he had simply disappeared into the air. The possibility of drowning was raised, but the divers insisted they'd covered the area thoroughly. The sonar showed nothing. And besides, where was the bike? Where were his shoes? A drowning left something. This left nothing. Investigators canvassed nearby houses, interviewed dog walkers, joggers, anyone who might have been on Jasper Trail that morning. Most saw nothing. One elderly man thought he heard a scream around 8 a.m., but he admitted it could have been birds. A jogger reported seeing a child near Route 42, 3 miles east, but couldn't confirm if it was Daniel. That lead, like so many others, went nowhere. Stillwater Pond was closed off for the week. Police stationed a cruiser nearby around the clock. Boats continued to scan the water. Every nearby culvert, drain, and trail was searched. No clothing, no evidence, no answers. And with each passing day, hope started to slip. Beth stayed home, fielding every phone call, every knock on the door, hoping for the one update that would undo the nightmare. Martin stayed in Marion for 2 weeks before his employer forced him to return to work. He left reluctantly, empty-handed, and angry. Not at anyone in particular, just at the weight of silence. By July, the flyers started to fade in the sun. The tips slowed. The phone stopped ringing. And in a quiet town like Marion, people stopped talking, at least out loud. But under their breath, in whispers between neighbors, at grocery store checkouts and gas station counters, theories began to form. Once, no one wanted to say anything publicly. Maybe Daniel didn't just get lost. Maybe someone knew exactly what happened to him, and maybe they were still out there. Within hours of Daniel's disappearance, Stillwater Pond was no longer just a quiet fishing spot tucked behind overgrown brush. It became the center of a full-scale search operation. By sundown that Sunday, squad cars were parked bumper to bumper down Jasper Trail Road. Police tape fluttered from trees. The pond's shoreline, once quiet and still, was lit by generator-powered floodlights and dotted with uniforms, shouting names into the trees. But every call echoed back with nothing. The first dive team arrived just after 9 p.m. 2 men in black suits wading chest-deep into water that hadn't been disturbed in decades. Their boots sank into a foot of muck. Visibility was next to zero. They relied on touch. One diver later described it as swimming through oil. They found nothing. Not a rod, not a shoe, not a piece of clothing, not even the peanut butter sandwich Daniel had packed. Just waterlogged branches, moss, and a few rusted beer cans from the 90s. By the following morning, word of Daniel's disappearance had spread beyond Marion. Volunteers began arriving from nearby towns, Converse, Gas City, Sweetser. Some brought dogs, others brought drones, maps, or their own trauma from past cases that had never been solved. People wanted to help, but no one could agree on how. Because from the beginning, nothing about this felt straightforward. 11-year-old boys don't just vanish, not without something, anything left behind. The K-9 units were brought in from Indianapolis, trained in both scent tracking and cadaver detection. They combed the perimeter, circling clockwise from the bike path to the cattails, then out toward the woods. One of the dogs showed a brief alert near the southern bank, the same area as the previous day's hit, but it faded almost immediately. No articles of clothing, no disturbed ground, no signs of a body. It was as if whatever scent had once been there had disappeared into the pond, or had been washed away entirely. As the search expanded, state police requested aerial scans from the Civil Air Patrol. They conducted flyovers, looking for signs of movement, disturbed brush, or heat signatures. But from above, Stillwater looked like any other rural pond, unmoving, empty. Authorities widened the radius, 2 miles, then 5. Dozens of volunteers were sent into the woods with orange vests, walkie-talkies, and maps marked with grid sections. They searched in tight lines, shoulder to shoulder. The terrain was rugged in places, thick with thorns, old barbed wire fences from when the land used to be cattle pasture. Some volunteers returned with cuts, ticks, and twisted ankles. None came back with answers. At a press conference that Tuesday, the Marion County Sheriff publicly ruled out a wildlife attack. There were no signs of blood, no torn fabric, no drag marks, no animal tracks. Daniel was too big for coyotes. Black bears hadn't been spotted in that part of Indiana in decades, and bobcats, while possible, didn't drag victims into water. The conclusion was clear. This wasn't Nature. This was something else. Local media started to shift the tone. Missing boy sparks mystery at Stillwater Pond. Community rallies, but questions grow. Comment sections online lit up with theories, some rational, some disturbing. Was there an old well nearby? A sinkhole? A predator hiding in the woods? People posted maps, red-circled areas of interest, shared grainy photos of the pond from Google Earth. The online sleuthing only deepened the unease. For Beth and Martin Wexler, the days blurred into one another. Beth refused to leave the search site. She sat on a folding chair near the trailhead, drinking lukewarm coffee and staring at the trees. Her voice was hoarse from yelling. Her hands never stopped shaking. Martin walked miles each day with the search parties, barely speaking. He lost track of how many times they looped the pond. No matter how many volunteers joined or how many boots stepped into that water, it never changed. Daniel wasn't there. Rumors began creeping in. A few locals remembered seeing a strange vehicle parked near the trail that morning. A silver SUV, older model, maybe a Ford Explorer. No plates were written down. No one could confirm if it had been there before. One man claimed he saw a figure watching from the tree line. Another said there had been recent break-ins just a few miles down the road. But police found no connections. The leads fizzled fast. Still, the whispers didn't stop. People in Marion started locking their doors again. Parents stopped letting kids ride bikes alone. Church groups held prayer circles. The local diner stopped playing music. The atmosphere shifted, subtle, but deeply felt. It wasn't just the fear of a missing child. It was the realization that if he could vanish, anyone could. Every search ended the same way. Exhausted people, quiet rides home, more questions. The pond refused to give anything back. And the more people looked, the less they found. By the end of the week, the command post downsized. Some volunteers stopped coming. The woods grew quiet again. Authorities scaled back from daily ground sweeps to targeted checks. Divers made one last sonar pass of the pond. Nothing. No evidence, no witnesses, no explanation. Only the bike remained unaccounted for, something police quietly admitted they couldn't reconcile. If Daniel had wandered off or fallen in the water, his bike would have been left behind at the trailhead. It wasn't, and that was what kept investigators awake at night, because that meant he never made it to the pond at all, or that someone, or something, interrupted him before he ever got there. The search didn't just end in silence. It ended in a new kind of fear, the kind that lingers long after the search teams go home. And beneath it all was one unresolved truth. Wherever Daniel Wexler went, he hadn't left on his own. In the days that followed the search, Stillwater Pond became more than a missing person scene. It became a Yapti question mark no one could answer. Investigators returned with stronger equipment, more precise sonar, and a new approach. The theory was simple. If Daniel had entered the water, intentionally or not, he would be in that pond. Bodies don't just vanish, and if they do, something always remains. They brought in side-scan sonar from the state police, dragging it in slow lines across the still, stagnant water. The images came back as muddied shadows. Decades of sediment, sunken branches, and natural debris made interpretation difficult. Objects were flagged and divers went down, hands sweeping blindly through the muck. Each time they resurfaced, they shook their heads. Old tires, twisted wire. One diver found a rusted tackle box, but it wasn't Daniel's. It had corroded shut, barnacled in place, likely untouched since the mid-'80s. By the end of that week, the pond had been scanned and dragged 3 separate times. The data was reviewed and confirmed. There were no large foreign objects in the water, no human remains, no clothing, no gear, no fishing pole. The water, despite how small and shallow it seemed, had swallowed nothing. For the first time since the search began, authorities started to seriously consider that Daniel might never have made it to the pond at all. But then came the rumor. Midway through the second week of the investigation, an officer reviewing neighborhood canvass reports flagged something curious. A local teenager, 17 at the time, claimed he had seen a weird car parked on the side of Jasper Trail Road early the morning Daniel disappeared. He described it as a silver SUV, boxy, older, maybe late 90s or early 2000s. It was parked at an angle near the trailhead. He couldn't see inside. He didn't think much of it until he saw the missing posters later that afternoon. Police followed up. They knocked on doors within a half-mile radius, asking if anyone else had seen the vehicle. A retired couple who lived at the corner of Jasper and Woodside said they remembered seeing a silver SUV in the area earlier that week, but weren't sure of the day. Another man said he saw a dark-colored truck that morning but thought it was black, not silver. An elderly woman described seeing a sedan, not an SUV at all. One person claimed it was white, another said it was green. The descriptions overlapped just enough to feel important, but contradicted each other just enough to be useless. No security cameras covered that stretch of road. It was too rural, too quiet. Even if a vehicle had been parked there, there was no proof it had anything to do with Daniel. No tire impressions, no oil drips, nothing was recorded. The lead stalled in ambiguity. But the damage was already done. The idea of a strange car, present just before a boy vanished, planted itself in the community like a splinter. Parents began asking more pointed questions. Was this a planned abduction? Has someone been watching him? Had there been other kids approached recently that no one reported? Police issued statements to ease public concern, but they had no answers. Just questions. Stillwater Pond, once a place of early morning peace and Sunday picnics, began to change. People stopped going. The trail leading into the woods grew less worn. Families that once walked the path together now crossed the street to avoid it. Even local teenagers, usually drawn to places with stories and ghost tales, stayed away. The pond felt different now. Not haunted, just contaminated by absence. Investigators began reviewing the timeline with a sharper lens. From when Daniel left his home to when Beth called 911, just over 7 hours had passed. They mapped his most likely route, the average biking speed of a boy his size, the estimated time it would have taken him to reach the pond, set up, and start fishing. It left a narrow window, one where something could have happened very quickly, and very quietly. Police dug into known offenders in the area. No registered sex offenders lived within a mile. No recent parolees with a history of violence. They issued subpoenas for phone tower pings near Jasper Trail during the morning hours of June 21st. Thousands of numbers flooded the system. Few could be identified. None stood out. The longer the investigation went without evidence, the more theories took root. Some believed Daniel had fallen into an old well or underground shaft no one had found yet. Others were convinced it had been an accident covered up by someone too scared to come forward. A driver who hit him. A local with a record. Then there were the darker theories, ones that couldn't be proven, but couldn't be ruled out either. Beth and Martin responded differently. Beth clung to the idea that Daniel had been taken and was still alive somewhere. She believed the pond was a distraction, that the answers were on the road, not in the water. Martin, more quietly, began to accept the possibility that their son might never come back. Not because he wanted to, but because every new search ended the same way, with nothing. Weeks passed. Stillwater's shoreline became overgrown again. The crime scene tape came down. The mobile command post packed up. Patrols slowed. People moved on. But the pond didn't. It sat there, untouched, refusing to reveal anything. And yet, something about it never stopped bothering the lead detective on the case. He would later admit, off the record, that something always felt wrong. Not just with the lack of evidence, but with the water itself. Not what was found in it, but what wasn't. Because in his 23 years on the force, he had never worked in a pond that quiet. In the immediate days after Daniel disappeared, the Wexlers operated on instinct, frantic, raw, and unscripted. Every morning began with updates from police. Every evening ended with hope thinning just a little more. But by the second week, once the pond had been searched, the dogs exhausted, and the maps erased and redrawn too many times, the silence began to set in. And silence is where fractures start. Beth stopped answering the phone. It wasn't intentional at first. She just couldn't take one more call that led nowhere. reporters, extended family, former friends, people from church, all asking the same questions she had no answers to. She sat on the living room couch, eyes locked on the front door, as if Daniel might walk through it, covered in mud but safe. The meals were untouched, laundry sat unfolded. Her world shrank to one room, one chair, and one thought. He was still out there, and she had to wait. Martin couldn't sit, couldn't stop. He left the house every day before sunrise, often without telling Beth where he was going. He'd drive loops around the outer neighborhoods, checking ditches, trailheads, construction sites. Sometimes he'd park outside the pond and just watch. Other times, he drove to rest stops an hour out, handing out flyers to truckers, hoping that maybe, just maybe, someone had seen something the police missed. Their communication dissolved. Beth didn't ask where Martin went. Martin stopped trying to explain. When they were in the same room, it felt colder than when they were apart, not because they didn't care, but because they were grieving two different losses. Beth clung to the belief that Daniel was alive. Martin was starting to believe he wasn't, and neither one could make space for the other's version of reality. 2 weeks in, they demanded the case be escalated to the FBI. A missing child, potentially abducted, possibly taken across state lines. But the agents they met with were cautious. Without evidence of a crime, no witness, no vehicle trace, no sign of foul play, it didn't yet meet the threshold for federal involvement. The lead investigator promised to keep them updated. Beth took that as a dismissal. Martin took it as confirmation that they were now on their own. The tension seeped into the community. At first, Marion rallied around the Wexlers. There were prayer circles, casserole drop-offs, and volunteers who showed up daily to help search. But over time, the questions began. Quietly at first, then whispers passed between neighbors and murmured at gas stations. Why did Beth let him go alone? Why was no one watching the clock? Why wasn't there a camera on that road? People speculated about Martin's past, about the divorce, about whether something had gone wrong at home that morning. A former co-worker told police Martin had a short fuse. A woman at the pharmacy claimed she once saw Beth yelling at Daniel in the parking lot. None of it amounted to anything, but the damage was done. Rumor had moved in where fact had stopped. The Wexlers noticed. Look at the grocery store, the shift in tone from friends, the way people who once dropped by now stayed silent. Beth stopped going out altogether. Martin kept his head down. They hired a private investigator from Indianapolis who charged them $1,800 for a 2-week review. He left behind a 10-page report that ended with no viable new leads. Beth kept it in a drawer like it meant something. Martin never opened it. At month 2, the mail began arriving in stacks, letters from strangers. Some are sympathetic, some accusatory. One handwritten note with no return address read, "I know what happened to your son. He didn't die. He was taken." Martin turned it over to the police. They traced the postmark to a sorting facility in Michigan. The handwriting didn't match any known persons of interest. Another dead end. Beth's world narrowed further. She began keeping notebooks, recording the names of everyone who'd been near the trailhead that day, the makes of vehicles parked nearby, sightings reported in forums, even long-shot psychic claims. She cataloged every detail, convinced that somewhere in the noise was a pattern. Martin, meanwhile, started drinking again, not openly, but enough to show. His hands shook, his voice grew flat, his frustration curdled into bitterness, not toward Beth, but toward the space that now lived between them. By fall, they were barely speaking. Counseling was offered through the sheriff's department, but they declined. Martin slept in the guest room. Beth sometimes slept on the couch. They were two people trying to survive the same storm from opposite ends of the house, unable to hear each other through the rain. 6 months after Daniel disappeared, the police quietly reduced the manpower on the case. There were no new leads, no developments, and no signs of reemergence. The public interest had faded. The posters on telephone poles peeled in the sun. News stories filled the local news. The world moved on. The Wexlers didn't. By the following spring, Martin filed for legal separation. Beth didn't contest it. There was no fight, just paperwork. They told the court it was irreconcilable grief, a phrase neither of them could say out loud. Martin moved into a small apartment near the industrial park. Beth stayed in the house, alone. No one blamed them, but no one helped them either. And as the second anniversary of Daniel's disappearance passed, Stillwater Pond remained untouched. The trail grew over. The rumors faded. But the Wexlers never stopped carrying the weight of a question they would ask themselves every day, in different ways, through different voices, spoken, screamed, or silently written in a journal. A question that no investigator, no scan, no tip, and no report could ever seem to answer. What kind of world swallows a boy and leaves nothing behind? Time moved forward, but the case never did. After the first year, the search for Daniel Wexler became something quieter, less urgent, less visible. The press conferences stopped. The neighborhood flyers were taken down or covered up. Stillwater Pond remained sealed off for months until the yellow tape wore thin and finally disappeared, altogether. The water went back to being still. But for the Wexlers, and those closest to the case, there was no going back, only waiting. Over the next decade, Daniel's disappearance remained one of Marion's most chilling mysteries, a case file that sat heavy in the drawer of a department that, deep down, already knew how it would end. But every so often, something would happen that pulled it all back to the surface. A new letter, a sighting, a name, a claim. And just like that, the wound would open again. In 2011, 2 years after the incident, a man in rural Ohio contacted the Marion Police Department, claiming he'd seen a boy who looked exactly like the Wexler kid walking out of a gas station near Chillicothe. The boy was thin, blond, and looked to be around 13. He was with an older man, mid-50s, gray beard, wearing a baseball cap. The caller wrote down a partial plate number from the van they left in. Police followed up, cross-referencing vehicle records, gas station security footage, and even sent the information to the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, but the plate didn't match anything in their system. The footage from the gas station was too blurry. Nothing could be verified. When the tip finally ran dry, Beth stayed up for 2 nights straight, convinced her son had been that boy. Martin didn't respond to her calls. In 2013, a typed letter arrived at the Marion County Sheriff's Office, postmarked from Illinois. The author claimed to be involved in the accidental death of a boy at a pond in Indiana. The letter was 2 pages long, rambling, full of contradictions. It referenced Stillwater by name but got basic details wrong, stating the boy had dark hair, that the incident happened in the late 90s. Forensics found no fingerprints, no DNA. The letter writer was never identified. Investigators believed it was a hoax, likely from someone craving attention or playing a cruel joke. Beth kept a copy of it anyway, reading it over and over, searching for anything they might have overlooked. Even a lie, she said once, has to come from somewhere. A few years later, in 2016, a woman from Michigan contacted Beth directly. She introduced herself as a psychic and said she'd received a vision about Daniel. According to her, he had fallen into the water but had not drowned. Her words were exact. He is in the water, but he is not dead. Beth recorded the call and sent it to the police. They dismissed it outright, labeling it under unsolicited psychic tips, a category that by then had grown thick with untraceable claims. But Beth couldn't ignore the specificity of the phrasing. She wrote those words on a sticky note and kept it in her fridge for years. Each tip, no matter how implausible, created a ripple. The FBI kept Daniel's profile active in VICAP, their national violent crime database, though updates became less frequent with each passing year. Detectives rotated out. The original lead retired in 2018, after more than 25 years on the force. He reportedly told a colleague during his retirement party that the Wexler case was the one thing he'd never made peace with. That some holes stay open, no matter how many times you go back in. Martin rarely spoke about the case anymore. After the divorce, he moved again, first to Fort Wayne, then later to a smaller town in southern Illinois. He remarried in 2017 and had another child, a daughter, though he remained low profile, refusing all media inquiries. A former friend said Martin never stopped carrying the weight, just got better at hiding it. Beth stayed in Marion. She never moved out of the house Daniel left from that morning. She kept his room the same posters on the walls, same bedding, same stack of books on the nightstand. She ran a local support group for parents of missing children for several years, but stopped after attendance dropped. Most of the others had found their children, alive or not. She never did. There were moments when new energy threatened to break through. In 2019, a true crime podcast picked up Daniel's case. The two hosts drove to Marion, interviewed local officials, and even managed to track down the teenager who had reported the silver SUV near the trail. But after 3 episodes, nothing new came from it. It was just another story for someone else's playlist. Beth never listened to the final episode. By 2020, public awareness had faded. Younger residents in Marion barely remembered the name. Stillwater Pond remained a place people avoided, not because they were afraid, but because it belonged to something they didn't understand. A place too quiet for its history. In 2021, the 10-year mark passed. No new statements were issued, no anniversaries observed. Even the media stayed silent. But Beth still marked the date. She left a small bouquet of flowers at the edge of the trail where Daniel's bike should have been. She placed it in the exact spot she'd imagined it standing, leaned against the wooden post near the trail map. No one saw her. She didn't want anyone to. The years blurred after that. Daniel's file remained open, technically, but inactive. What was left of the investigation had become a museum of leads, cold, dead, and carefully cataloged, names without faces, tips without endings, pain without language. And then, quietly, in the fall of 2023, a letter arrived at the town's public works department. It had nothing to do with Daniel. It was a request to evaluate drainage issues along the eastern side of Stillwater Pond. Recent storms had caused erosion. A county team would be conducting maintenance. The job was standard: unclog sediment, inspect pipes, and reinforce the banks. No one knew that in just a few weeks something would be uncovered, something old, something buried, something that, for the first time in 15 years, might finally answer the question no one could let go of. Where did Daniel Wexler go? By late August 2023, the water level at Stillwater Pond had dropped so low that even the oldest residents couldn't remember it ever looking that barren. Drought, combined with years of clogged runoff channels and neglected storm drains, had turned the once glassy pond into a stagnant basin of exposed rock, muck, and black silt. What had been an ecosystem was now a problem. The town filed for a county-funded maintenance grant, citing flood risk and mosquito breeding. The project wasn't large enough to make headlines, just a drainage evaluation and culvert clearing. No one expected it to mean anything more than that. But for some, the change sparked something older, something unresolved. The sight of the half-empty pond triggered a quiet murmur online. A few local Reddit users posted cell phone pictures showing the cracked earth and exposed shoreline. One user, under the name Backtrail Hunter, wrote a caption that simply read, "It's been 15 years. Wonder what's under there now." The post barely got 10 upvotes, but someone else shared it to a larger subreddit focused on unsolved mysteries. From there, it started to spread. Within days, the story had resurfaced. Daniel Wexler, the boy who vanished without a trace from Stillwater Pond in the summer of 2009. A name once spoken in whispers, now typed in bold font under digital speculation threads. Theories reignited like dry leaves, each one trying to fill in the same blank space. Some users pointed out that the timing of Daniel's disappearance and the location of the trail meant he could have been intercepted before ever reaching the pond. Others argued he had fallen into an underground tunnel system no one had properly investigated. A few leaned hard into conspiracy, suggesting the area had once been used as an illegal dumping ground and that someone with authority had buried the truth. What drew even more attention was a short video uploaded by a group of amateur urban explorers who called themselves Hoosier Forgotten. They had gone to Stillwater Pond one evening after seeing the low water reports and filmed a slow walk along the dried edges. The video was quiet, almost eerie, with no narration, just wind, bugs, and the crunch of boots. Toward the end, they pointed out a large, rusted-out pipe barely visible beneath years of growth. They didn't enter it, just filmed it from a distance, noting that it had never been visible before. The video ended with a pan back toward the tree line where Daniel's bike was never found. The clip went viral within a day. Comment sections flooded with speculation. View counts soared. People who had never heard of Daniel were now immersed in his story. Armchair detectives pulled up satellite maps from 2009 and compared them to present-day images. Threads debated the layout of the old drainage system. One user insisted the original search had missed a secondary culvert that was listed in a 1984 land assessment but never mentioned in police reports. Another uploaded a copy of a soil and water drainage permit from 1979, proving there were at least 2 undocumented overflow shafts near the southern end of the pond. Back in Marion, the sudden attention didn't go unnoticed. A public works crew assigned to the maintenance project was already in the process of draining the remaining water from the lowest end of the pond. They had no idea their ordinary work was becoming the backdrop of something far larger online. The plan was to clear debris from the main culvert, assess blockage, and reinforce the banks to prevent seasonal overflow. Simple infrastructure work. But by early September, the job changed. After a local reporter reached out to the county about the renewed interest in the Wexler case, law enforcement quietly reopened the file. Not as a formal investigation, but as a reassessment of context. They weren't looking for new evidence. They didn't expect any. But the drain project gave them one last reason to look. On September 14th, workers broke through a thick sediment layer that had blocked access to a lower auxiliary pipe at the edge of the pond. The pipe had been built decades earlier, long before any of the current city officials had been in office. Most people had forgotten it existed at all. As they began clearing the blockage, a worker noticed something unusual jammed into the opening. A twisted piece of rusted metal, oddly shaped, buried beneath years of sludge and debris. By the next day, law enforcement had quietly secured the site. No official announcement was made. The pond remained blocked off from the public, though rumors were already spreading through town. Some said a bike had been found. Others said it was bones. Most dismissed it as online nonsense. After all, stories like Daniel's attract noise. They always had. But the tone changed when a source inside Public Works confirmed anonymously that law enforcement had taken custody of multiple items removed from the pipe. Items they described as aged, partially decomposed, and potentially connected to the original incident. News didn't break in the newspaper. It broke online. Reddit threads lit up. TikTok accounts reposted screenshots of old missing posters. YouTube videos dissected drone footage. Everyone had a theory. Everyone was sure they were right. But outside of the noise, back in Marion, one question started echoing again, this time louder than before. What if Daniel had been there all along? And if so, what had kept him hidden for 15 years? The final phase of the Stillwater Pond drainage project was supposed to be routine. After weeks of sediment removal, reinforced piping, and slow, methodical progress, the last step was clearing the deepest section of the eastern basin, a pocket of compacted earth where water had pooled for decades. Most of the crew had already moved on to other projects. Only few remained, assigned to monitor the final flow out of a secondary culvert buried beneath years of debris and silt. On the morning of September 21st, just before 9 a.m., one of the crew members radioed that they had struck something metallic under the backflow channel. At first, they thought it was just old scrap, remnants of farm equipment or fencing that had washed in over time. But as they cleared away more of the surrounding sediment, the shape became harder to dismiss. It wasn't jagged like a pipe or twisted like wire. It was curved, uniform, and unmistakably deliberate in its design. They pulled it free slowly, careful not to damage what had been preserved under pressure and darkness for more than a decade. When it surfaced, the crew fell silent. What they were looking at wasn't rusted equipment or scrap metal. It was a bicycle frame, small, bent in places, caked in black silt and rust. But under the corrosion, traces of red paint were still visible. A single training peg hung from the rear axle, half dissolved. Nearby, wedged in the same channel, they found what appeared to be a decaying shoe, flattened, the sole warped by years of moisture. The logo on the tongue was barely legible, but distinct enough for one of the responding officers to recognize it immediately. A red Nike sneaker, size 5 youth. Just above it, caught in a jag of rusted mesh, were several long strands of blonde hair. The discovery halted the entire operation. Law enforcement returned to the site with cadaver dogs and a forensic team. The surrounding area was sealed off. Soil samples were taken. Every inch of the exposed culvert and runoff channel was photographed, logged, and bagged for analysis. The items were transported to the Indiana State Police Forensic Lab under a sealed chain of custody. It took 5 days for the DNA results to return. The strands of hair were a match. So was trace DNA found inside the deteriorated sneaker. There was no margin of error. After 15 years, they had finally recovered physical evidence connected to Daniel Wexler. But with the confirmation came another, more chilling realization. There were no remains, no bones, no teeth, no fragments, no biological material consistent with decomposition in the surrounding soil. The drainpipe was intact. The area immediately downstream had been scanned and cleared. Even the dogs weren't alert to any nearby human scent. Wherever Daniel had ended up, it wasn't here, at least not anymore. The bicycle frame was analyzed by forensic technicians. The back wheel was warped inward, consistent with long-term compression. There was no sign of violent damage, no impact marks or signs of tampering. The pedals were intact. The handlebars were partially detached, likely due to corrosion, not force. Nothing pointed to foul play, but nothing suggested a natural accident either. The shoe was even more peculiar. It was the right foot, meaning the left was missing. Its state of preservation was strange, better than expected for something submerged so long, but badly deformed from the way it had been wedged in the metal. Forensic investigators determined that it had likely been lodged in that position for more than 10 years. And yet, the location where the items were found didn't align with where police had initially concentrated their search. This culvert had never been mapped during the original investigation. At the time, the pipe had been sealed off by natural buildup, making it virtually invisible to the sonar scans and dive teams that focused on the central body of water. The moment the confirmation went public, Marion changed overnight. Local news stations descended on the town. The pond was now a crime scene again. Theories spread fast, some grounded in the details, others spinning far into speculation. If Daniel's belongings had been in the drain all these years, why hadn't they surfaced sooner? Has the pond truly been searched thoroughly, or had something or someone placed them there long after the fact? Beth Wexler was contacted within hours of the confirmation. According to those close to her, she didn't cry. She didn't speak. She simply asked one question. Where's the rest of him? Martin didn't issue a statement. His wife told reporters they were processing things privately but appreciated the support. She declined to answer whether they believed this was the end of the case. Back at Stillwater, the remaining drainage work was suspended indefinitely. Crews brought in ground-penetrating radar and a full forensic survey team. Nothing else was found. Nobody. No clothing, no answers, only 3 objects, a bike frame, a single shoe, and the hair of a boy who was supposed to be home by dinner. What those objects confirmed was only part of the story. What they failed to explain was everything else. And for law enforcement, the new question became as haunting as the old one. If Daniel Wexler had been inside that pond, why wasn't he still there? The discovery of Daniel's bicycle, sneaker, and hair inside the old culvert shifted the case from a forgotten cold file into something active, alive, and once again deeply uncertain. It didn't bring closure. It reopened everything, and it forced investigators to re-examine not only the physical space of Stillwater Pond, but also the human element, what people said, what they remembered, and what they hadn't shared 15 years earlier. The new investigation began where it should have started long ago: the timeline. Detectives went back through the original files, scanning every interview transcript, every witness statement, every handwritten note from the early days of the search. It was tedious work, full of gaps and half-memories. But buried inside a page from June 23, 2009, 2 days after Daniel disappeared, was a name that stood out: Leslie Chambers, a neighbor who lived 3 blocks from the Wexlers at the ET. Time. She had told officers back then that she saw Daniel ride past her house that morning, heading toward Jasper Trail like always. But nothing beyond that. It had been filed as a minor confirmation, a routine sighting. But in light of the drainage discovery, detectives reached out to her again. This time, Leslie hesitated. She said there was something she'd left out. According to her updated statement, Daniel had actually stopped about halfway down the block. He dismounted his bike and stood for a few seconds, looking toward an overgrown side path that led behind a row of abandoned utility buildings near the old public works shed. Leslie said he then walked his bike slowly toward it. She hadn't thought much of it at the time. Maybe he was just exploring. But she never saw him return from that direction, and she never mentioned it during the initial investigation because, in her words, they didn't ask. That small detour, a moment of curiosity, hesitation, or distraction, changed the scope of everything. Detectives began asking new questions about that overgrown path. Where did it lead? What structures had once been back there? Who had access? The city records department pulled blueprints dating back to the early 1980s. Most were scanned copies of hand-drawn plans, poorly labeled, out of scale. But one detail stuck out. Near the eastern edge of the pond, just behind the spillway, there had once been a maintenance access shaft. It was part of the original overflow design for the drainage system. A vertical tunnel, 8 feet deep, leading into a runoff channel that connected to the main culvert line, the same culvert where Daniel's belongings had just been recovered. That shaft was supposed to have been sealed in 1996, after an inspection deemed it unsafe. City records confirmed it had been decommissioned, but no one could say for certain if it had actually been closed properly. And the man who would have known, the groundskeeper assigned to the area during the 1990s, had died in 2017. His name was Frank Whelan. Frank's name came up once in the original case. He had spoken briefly with investigators in 2009, mentioning that the spillway was clogged and mostly useless and that some of the pipes hadn't been touched in years. He'd also reportedly told a volunteer during the search that there was an old pit back there somewhere, but no one followed up at the time. The area had been too overgrown, and the map didn't show anything. Now, that offhand comment felt like a missed warning. Detectives requested a full 3D mapping of the current and historic drainage system beneath Stillwater Pond. Engineers used ground-penetrating radar and updated survey equipment to build a digital model of the layout. What they found was sobering. There was, in fact, a shaft. Just beyond the spillway, covered by layers of roots and soil, was a reinforced concrete opening, partially collapsed but still intact. It led downward, into a narrow access tunnel choked with sediment and debris that had remained untouched for decades. The dimensions lined up. The location matched the directional flow toward the culvert where the bike had been found, and the drop, from the surface to the shaft floor, was almost exactly the height of an 11-year-old child. But what the model also revealed was something stranger. The tunnel didn't just open downward. It extended further under the far bank of the pond toward a second junction point that had no known access or maintenance records. A sealed-off area with no current utility function, no scheduled inspections, and no mapped outlet. A dead zone. The theory formed quickly. Daniel may have taken the detour out of curiosity. He may have stumbled across the access shaft, partially exposed. He may have climbed onto the edge, lost his footing, and fallen inside. If the tunnel was filled with water at the time, or if the fall had injured him, he could have been trapped, alone, unseen. And over time, water flow and sediment could have carried his belongings downstream into the culvert where they were eventually found. But if that was the case, if this was a tragic accident, why hadn't the shaft ever been found during the original search? And why, according to the forensic team, had the culvert where Daniel's items were discovered been intentionally sealed from the outside? That detail, shared quietly between detectives, changed the tone once again, because it meant that someone, at some point, knew that part of the system was open, and someone had taken steps to close it, not permanently, just enough to keep it hidden. Investigators began compiling a list of all city workers, contractors, and maintenance crews who had access to the drainage layout between 1996 and 2010. The list was long. Records were incomplete. Many had since moved. Others had died. One had a criminal history. Another was the uncle of a former suspect in an unrelated missing persons case. But no connection could be proven. What began as a theory of an accident was now shadowed by the possibility of something far more deliberate. Because if Daniel had fallen by chance, then time, water, and oversight had buried the truth. But if someone else had found that shaft first, they may have buried much more than that. The search crews returned to Stillwater Pond with a new purpose. For the first time in over a decade, they weren't just looking for clues. They were digging into a part of the landscape that had never been touched, never even officially recorded. The forgotten shaft, buried near the old spillway, sat under more than 3 feet of compacted soil and vegetation. On the surface, it looked like nothing. A patch of earth surrounded by brush and low tree limbs, but underground, it was something else entirely. On October 2nd, the forensic excavation team broke through what had once been a concrete cap. It was weathered but intact, thicker than expected and covered in vines. It took hours to remove without disturbing what lay beneath. When they finally lifted the last slab, the smell hit first, not strong, but distinct. Stale air, decaying sediment, and something older, organic. The shaft descended nearly 8 feet down, a perfect square lined with crumbling bricks and reinforced with rusted rebar. At the bottom, a narrow tunnel led horizontally beneath the pond, toward the direction of the collapsed culvert, where Daniel's belongings had surfaced just weeks before. The team worked in silence. Lights were lowered in. A small crawler robot, usually used for mine inspections, was guided through the narrow passage. Within 15 feet, it found what no one had dared to expect after all this time. A shoe, torn and flattened, the left match to the one recovered from the drain. Another 2 feet in, lodged against the tunnel wall, was a child-sized backpack, weathered beyond recognition. Nearby, a rusted fishing reel, a faded scrap of fabric, later determined to be nylon mesh from a folding camp stool, and deeper still, bones, small, humans, partially submerged in compacted sludge. The remains were carefully extracted over 2 days. They were fragile, fragmented, but intact enough for confirmation. Dental records matched. DNA was later verified. 15 years after Daniel Wexler left his home with a tackle box and a peanut butter sandwich, he had been found, not far from where everyone had looked, just beneath it. But the discovery only answered one part of the mystery. Because once the remains were removed and the tunnel fully scanned, investigators turned their attention to the shaft entrance itself, and what they found disturbed everyone on site. The seal wasn't natural. The cap covering the shaft had been reinforced with industrial-grade mortar, different from the original construction. It wasn't the kind of work done in the 1980s when the shaft was first decommissioned. It was newer. Forensic analysis estimated the materials were consistent with supplies used in the early 2000s, not old enough to be from the original build, but just old enough to match the timeline of Daniel's disappearance. Even more troubling were the tool marks. On the outer lip of the seal, investigators found clear impressions, chisel notches, pry points, and what appeared to be repeated hammer strikes, all on the exterior edge. According to the forensic report, these were made after the shaft had been closed. The implication was immediate. Someone had sealed it from the outside. Accident theory no longer made sense. If Daniel had fallen in and no one had known, the shaft would have remained open or naturally collapsed. But it hadn't. It had been actively and deliberately resealed, covered so well that it went unnoticed by search teams, sonar, and investigators for 15 years. Detectives tried to follow the evidence, but the trail was too old. City records from the late 90s were incomplete. The contractor who had overseen the drainage repairs in 1996 had died in 2011. His company no longer existed. No work orders were found mentioning the shaft, no documentation of a resealing. No witness ever recalled seeing anyone near the spillway around the time of Daniel's disappearance. If someone had gone out there to cover the shaft, they had done it alone, quietly, and without leaving a trace. The working theory evolved. Investigators now believed Daniel had likely found the shaft on his own. He may have entered out of curiosity or fallen by accident. The drop was survivable, but the darkness and narrowness of the space would have made escape nearly impossible. It wasn't just the fall, it was the tunnel. Disorienting, cold, with no light, no sound, and no clear exit. Experts speculated he may have wandered inside, calling for help, unable to climb out. And if the tunnel was already partially blocked or flooded, the odds of survival were nearly zero. But that didn't explain the seal, and that unanswered question changed everything. Was it possible someone else had found the shaft after Daniel? Someone who discovered what had happened and instead of calling it in, chose to hide it? A worker trying to avoid liability? A trespasser with no business being there? Or something worse? The idea that Daniel could have been saved, if only someone had come forward, was almost too much for his family to accept. Beth didn't attend the forensic press conference. She released a written statement only, saying she was grateful for the discovery, but unwilling to mistake confirmation for justice. Martin showed up but didn't speak. He stood near the back, arms crossed, staring at the satellite images of the shaft system projected on a white screen. And yet, even with the remains recovered, even with the pieces identified, the Wexlers still didn't get a full story. There was no final timeline. No one was held accountable. No answers for why a boy's life ended in a forgotten tunnel beneath a pond in a town that had long stopped searching. There was only this. He didn't run away. He didn't drown. He was right there, all along. And someone knew. Despite the discovery of Daniel's remains and the confirmation of how he likely died, one question still remained unanswered. Who sealed the shaft? Forensic teams found no fingerprints, no DNA, no tools left behind. No one came forward. No one had ever been seen near the spillway in the days following his disappearance. Whether it was a city worker trying to avoid liability, a local with a guilty conscience, or something more intentional, investigators were left with speculation and silence. Theories spread quickly, online, in town, even within the department. Maybe someone found him after the fall and panicked. Maybe he was never meant to be found at all. But without proof, there could be no closure. Only confirmation. At Daniel's reburial, Beth Wexler stood alone beside the grave. She didn't cry and didn't speak for long, but when asked how it felt, she gave the one sentence that captured everything the case had become. "I wanted closure," she said, steady, quiet. "I got confirmation." Not the same thing. And for everyone who had followed the case, who had wondered, waited, and hoped, that line stayed with them, because knowing what happened still didn't explain why it was hidden for so long.